So now I've done that. That's great. So we are in fact recording our webinar today. So if you have somebody, somebody who's wasn't able to be here or is going to be watching it later, or you want to review something that you hear today, you will have that option. As we go along, I encourage you to keep track of your questions. You can just type them right into the chat window or into the Q&A window, either one, and we will check on those as we go along, although we may not have a chance to answer them until we get to the end, but we will, don't forget them. I've posted in the chat window a link that you can use to download the slides for the presentation. And then the other piece of housekeeping is that if you have requested a certificate of participation, we will be completing those after the webinar today based on the attendance. So if you requested one, you will automatically receive it. Depending on the numbers, it sometimes takes us a few days. So if you do not have it, and remember to check your junk folder, your spam folder, as well as your inbox. If you don't have it within a week, then please let us know, because we will make sure we get you what you need. So again, I'm very happy to be here, and also particularly happy to have a colleague presenting with me today, Ann Fitz. Ann Fitz is the co-founder and CEO of Readable English, a program that makes English more predictably phonetic without changing the spelling of words. And as the CEO of the company and everything else she does, she draws on over 20 years of experience as a reading specialist, working with children with a variety of reading challenges, including phonological processing, language disorders, reading, writing, and math disorders, hyperlexia, and ADHD. So she's seen a lot of people struggle learning to read. Early in her career, she was trained in the Linda Mood Bell system, and then subsequently she ran her own learning center called the Reading Clinic in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm delighted to have Ann with me today for this. So one of the things that we wanted to do to get started here was to just find out a little bit about who our audience is. And so if you could just check on the primary role that you we all have lots of roles usually, but trying to find out what kind of students you might be working with. So that would be great if I can see people starting to respond to the poll already. And so far it's a dead even heat between young children and elementary, middle, and high school readers. Oh, and we have an English language learner who popped up. Okay, so it looks like people have had a chance to respond, and I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. And so, as you can see, the about half and half, a little bit of English language learning going on there, but mostly very early readers and struggling readers. So that's very helpful. Appreciate and thank you for sharing that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about, first of all, about language in the brain, because we have language before we start to read. And then we'll talk about reading in the brain, and we'll follow that up with a little exploration of why English is a particularly hard language to learn to read. And then some neuroscience-based approaches to supporting the development of reading skills. So this is an image of the brain showing the 4 lobes, which are the part of the cortex, the outer layers of the brain. And all of these are involved in reading. In the back, our occipital lobe is responsible for visual processing. So for sighted people, of course, blind is a little bit different. But this is where we see images that we connect to sounds to learn what words mean. And it's also clearly involved in reading because we take in that visual input. Our temporal lobes, which are right above our ears on the sides of our brains, are responsible for auditory processing. So this is where we hear language sounds and assemble them to understand words. Our parietal lobe is where we assemble and correlate sensory information and where we sense where we are in space. But it also turns out there's a little bit of the parietal lobe called the angular gyrus. So there's a little terminology, neuroscience terminology, you can try to stump your friends with later today. And the angular gyrus is where helps to assemble the information that we need to help us understand words and concepts. So it's almost like a little staging ground. And then our frontal lobes, of course, are where conscious thought and decision-making and planning happen. And there's a part of the frontal lobes that's dedicated to and critical for speech production. Now we can look at this in a variety of ways, and a lot of what we knew before the advent of technology was from medicine and injuries that people experienced in different parts of our brain. But today, through the magic of various brain imaging techniques, we can actually look inside. And so this is an interesting slide because it deals with many functions of language and to some degree reading. So if we're just passively viewing, I'm going to say a couple of other things about this. So in these maps, the left hand, the front of the brain is on the left and the back of the brain is on the right. The areas that are in yellow, orange, red, and white are the areas where the most activity is taking place. The areas of blue and green and are a little bit less active. The black parts look like there's nothing going on there, but that's not the case. It just means, because all of our brains are always working, it just means that there's the least activity in those areas. So it's just the difference of the levels of activation. So in the first one in the top left, we see the back of our brain lit up, which is what we'd expect. That's where visual processing happens in our occipital lobe. And so we're seeing that part most active. In the next one on to the right, on the top right, is a scan of someone listening to words, where you're seeing the activity in the temporal lobes, which is what we would expect for auditory processing. In the bottom left one, we see someone speaking words, so we're seeing activation in the motor cortex, as well as a little bit in the area of the frontal lobes involved in speech production. And then finally on the bottom right, you can see two different parts of our brains being activated. The one in the front is an area that has been, it was named after a researcher named Paul Broca, so it's called Broca's area, and that's actually critically involved in speech production. And then in the back, the lit up area is named after a researcher named Wernicke, and that's where our words and meaning are processed. And so both of those are happening, of course, when we're in the process of generating. Here it's generating verbs, but this is also, as we'll see, essentially the language processing, the main language processing areas of our brain. So we have a little bit of a sense now about where all this happens, but then the question becomes, how did we learn to do this? How do our brains get to the point where they can learn these words and we learn to speak them and all that kind of thing? So what I want to do just for a couple minutes here is think about the concept of learning. We use this term all the time, whether we're in school or in a learning clinic or often at home if we're parents. But we don't always really think about what learning means. So I'm going to ask you for a moment to think about how you would define learning. And if you feel like sharing that with us, you can just go ahead and tap that into the chat window. And take a look at mine. See if I see any thoughts. I'll give everybody a minute or so to think about your definition of learning. A process by which knowledge and skills are acquired. Very good. Wonder if anybody else wants to contribute. Right, so typically those are that type of answer, acquiring knowledge and skills, Sometimes I get people who say it's about being able to demonstrate that you can do that, or being able to also to recall that information, reproduce it. And all of those are the typical ways that we do think about learning, and they're certainly reflective of our experience of learning. But learning can also be characterized, and the way that we tend to think about it is a biological process. So at its very core, learning is the process of making and strengthening connections between thousands of neurons forming neural networks or maps in our brain. Our brains are learning machines, and they build themselves through experience, through interaction with the outside world, and that causes connections to form and to be strengthened among all of these neurons. So when we hear something, as we do in any learning experience, a network of neurons is activated. When that group of neurons has activated together, and it does it repeatedly, then it's more likely that activating one or more of those neurons will cause the others to activate within that network. So when it comes to remembering something, we don't go into a vault and pull out that information. What we're doing when we're remembering something is reactivating, reconstructing the same neurons that were connected in that original experience, or as they've been modified over time and through practice. So that is why the neuroscientists like to say that neurons that fire together wire together. The more we activate that group of neurons, the stronger that tendency is going to be. And that's going to be the case in language as well. Words that we practice over and over again, concepts that we practice over and over again are going to result in stronger neural connections. So just as a little reminder, we're going to take just a quick look here at some neurons in our brains. Our brains have about 85 billion brain cells, neurons. They also have some other kinds of cells, but about 85 billion neurons. And these connect at junctures that are called synapses. So information, you can see 3 neurons in this diagram. Each one has an axon, which is the way information is communicated. So the neuron sends a signal down the axon via electrical and then chemical signals. And at the point where it connects to the other neuron, that is the synapse. And each neuron also has many, many ways to receive information. Just one way to send it, but many ways to receive it. And those receiving spikes that sort of look like branches of a tree are called dendrites. And in fact, dendrites comes from the Greek word for branch. And there are tons and tons and tons of these. So an average neuron might have 6,000 dendrites and trillions of connections throughout our brains. And all of that is where human behavior starts, with these connections and these junctures. So when we see those areas lit up in that slide before, that's huge networks of neurons being activated in order to manage language and speech. So this is a little picture of what neurons actually look like in our brains. This is, of course, enlarged many, many times. You can see the little black dots. Those are the cell bodies. And the rest of it is all of those connections, those axons and dendrites connecting. And you can see how dense all of those connections are. So imagine all of these neurons activating, transmitting signals electrically and then chemically over and over again. In fact, each neuron sends maybe 1,000 signals a second. So a very, very busy place in our brains. But we didn't start off with all of this, with all of these connections. And in fact, here are a couple more images of the brain from the cortex. The one on the left is of a newborn, and the one on the right of a 2-year-old. So we have, when we are born, about all of the brain cells we will ever need. We have about 85 billion brain cells neurons when we're born, and we have about 85 billion today as adults. So our brains don't grow, but they do grow pretty dramatically, of course, because our brains when we're born might weigh a pound or so. And then by the time that we're 5 or 6, it has doubled in size and really is about 90% of its adult size and weight. But that isn't because it's growing neurons, that's because it's growing connections. And you can see that very vividly in the image on the right. So a bunch of cells, but now we've got lots and lots and lots of connections. And these are what enable us to form neural networks that interact with our environment and that we allow us to walk and talk and grasp and run and create art and solve a math problem and do everything else that we do. This is very graphically a picture of learning. Now, it turns out that the image on the right, the 2-year-old, is actually has too many. The brain at that point has too many connections. It's had so many experiences and it didn't know necessarily which were the most relevant and the most important to keep track of. And so what the brain will do at that age of 2 is to start to prune away some of those unnecessary connections. Now, those unnecessary connections result in what we also sometimes refer to as the terrible twos. So in addition to being a picture of learning, this is a picture of the terrible twos. So in terms of language, when we're born, we can hear the sounds of any language in the world. And by some counts, there are 6,000 of them. However, starting at a pretty young age, and of course that pruning process, as we said, happens in a very direct way, in a very aggressive way when we're 2, because we've formed all of these unnecessary ones. But all those early neural connections that represent the sounds, those that have been reinforced that we hear in the language that's around us day after day, are the ones that have the strongest neural connections, and the other ones will be pruned. They'll just wither away. And all of this forming of connections and the pruning of connections is a feature of the brain that is referred to as plasticity. And we have plasticity in our brains throughout our lives. However, young brains are much more plastic than older brains. It's easier to learn language, of course, when we're young. So this is a little picture, bringing back our model of the brain, a picture of the language pathway. We start with it back in Wernicke's area where we keep the meaning of words, and then when we determine the words that we want to use, we have to produce them, which we do in the front of our brain in the area called Broca's area. So this is a basic picture. We saw that in the brain scans as well, and you're seeing it on the left in the model of the brain. For our attendee, our participant today who works with English language learners, the same language pathway exists for English language learners as for native English speakers. However, it's going to make a difference as to when that second language, when English starts to be learned. If it's very young, the language will be learned basically in the same way that it was learned, that any initial language is learned. There's no area in either case in Wernicke's area, that's where all of our vocabulary and lexicon and the meaning of words is stored. But it will make a difference in the production area of our brain, the language and speech production area in Broca's area. Students who learn a second language or learn English very, very young are going to store that speech production capacity and process in the same area as their initial language. It all becomes part of that same mechanism. But if you're learning it later, it's going to require, it's going to actually get stored in a different area, which is why the ability to produce speech, particularly without an accent, becomes much more challenging because we're actually having it in a different part of our brain. So that's going to complicate things a little bit too, certainly when we come to reading. So our brains are performing, that's sort of where it happens. And now we want to look at a little bit of some of the key processes that are involved in language. So this is a chart that we use to talk about cognitive processes, the skills that are the foundation for learning and for everything that we do. And we're going to take a look at just a few of the processes that are involved in language, and we're going to then carry them over into how important they are in reading. So in this chart, down at the very bottom, the very basic processes that our brains use to take in information from the outside world, we call foundational cognitive skills. And on top of that are a group of cognitive skills that are now being referred to as executive functions. And a lot of the very beginning parts of learning and managing language are going to happen down at this area. And then, of course, when we learn to do it formally with language arts and SEL and STEM, we're up at a significantly higher level. But these basic processes play critical roles in both language and reading. So we're going to take a look at, first of all, one cognitive process that is in that very bottom box. It's called sensory memory. So information comes into our brains, of course, through our senses. And when it comes to language learning, a lot of it is auditory and visual. We hear the sounds dog, and we hold on to that for a fraction of a second in sensory memory. It doesn't hang out there very long. While we do that, we have to recognize the sounds and the word while we're seeing perhaps a picture of a dog or a dog itself, or we're looking at it and it's so barking as well, we might hear that. But the important part of the word is hearing the phonemes that are part of that word. Then we drop that very quickly. Our brains have to make way for new information, so that sensory memory doesn't hold on to things for very long. This is where all the information that comes into our brains passes through. We discard the vast majority of it, of course, because it's too much information, and we only attend to that information that we think is going to be relevant. And then our brains decide actually in fractions of a second that it will be something important, something we need to actually pay attention to. And information that doesn't have any meaning isn't processed, or very seldom processed or stored. So it just sort of goes away. And that's important because, of course, if we aren't taking in that information, or our students are distracted, they're always paying attention to something, but if it's not what we want them to, then that information may not even be getting into the process that could enable it to become comprehended and moved into long-term memory. Then another process I want to talk a little bit about is called working memory. And essentially, if our brains decide that something is important enough, then we're going to keep that neural network active, the one that's thinking about the dog, and we're going to elaborate it. Here's another example of one of my favorite childhood books that starts this way. If you want to find Cherry Tree Lane, all you have to do is ask the policeman at the crossroads. He will push his helmet slightly to one side, scratch his head thoughtfully, and then he will point his huge white-gloved finger and say, "First to your right, second to your left, sharp right again, and you're there. Good morning." Obviously, you can read it here, but imagine the story being read aloud, as I just did, just using the language processing part of your brain. Do you have an image in your mind of how to get to Cherry Tree Lane? The ability to activate and keep that network activated as you're thinking about it is working memory. And it's how we comprehend and how we are able to think about what it is that we're hearing when it comes to language. It's going to become also, of course, obviously pretty important. So a good bit of our ability to understand language, and of course then when we get to reading, it's going to be true as well, is the capacity of our working memory. This is our only conscious processing, and it's where we retrieve all of the information we need to carry out a task, whether it's understanding something or doing a math computation or whatever it happens to be. And when we rehearse things in working memory, we strengthen those those connections. So if you think about when we're talking to kids, we will repeat words over and over. They'll say a word, we'll repeat it again. And all of that is helping that those sounds and things get rehearsed in working memory. And that's what's going to eventually allow it to focus or to become encoded in long-term memory so that we don't have to think about it consciously. I also want to talk about one other of the executive functions. So working memory is one executive function. A second of the core executive functions is called inhibitory control. And a lot of teachers, I don't know if I say most, but many teachers think about inhibitory control the way that it sounds like it's controlling yourself. And it is certainly involved in self-regulation and behavior and things like emotional regulation. But it also turns out that it's part and parcel of some much more basic processes, or some much more process that we don't always associate it with. So, as I said, when we practice something over and over again, we get the patterns of language in our mind. And one of those patterns is that we learn that the way to make the past tense of a verb is to add the d at the end, the ed, in when it's written. But walk becomes walked. I helped my brother tie his shoes. I helped my brother tie his shoes. We walked to the park. So all of those those are the ways that most words become past tense. When we encounter irregularities, we have to suppress that rule, and that's actually something that inhibitory control is involved in. We have to actually suppress that, and then we have to be able to use the new rule. So those mistakes, first of all, when children are very young, they make the mistake simply because they're following the pattern. Once they start to use that rule, then we're going to be involving inhibitory control in the suppression of the regular rule in favor of the one that we need to use because our grammar is so complicated and messy. All right, so all of those processes and neural apparatus we use for language, we're also going to be using for reading. But of course, reading is even more complicated, and in some cases, a lot more complicated. It turns out, and this may not surprise any of you, is that reading is an unnatural act. We evolved as a species to speak. We have used oral language for at least 250,000 years. I've heard numbers that are longer than that, but pretty confidently at least that long. And the ability to speak is hardwired in the brain. You see children using language, twins, for example, at a very young age, developing their own language, even if they're not hearing it. And so this is something that's hardwired. We were born, our biological destiny is speaking, but it is not reading. And it's only for about the last 4,000 years that we have worked on trying to represent the sounds of language using written symbols. And reading is not hardwired in the brain. So how do we learn to do that? Well, remember that concept of plasticity. We can use that to our advantage to help the brain learn something that it's never done before and that it wasn't even necessarily evolved to do. And what this does, plasticity allows the brain to make these connections in circuits and in pathways with structures that were originally designed to do more basic processes such as vision and spoken language. But we don't pass those on in the genes, and every individual has to master and create these new structures and these new connections individually. So once again, let's just take a picture of the language pathway going from Wernicke's area up into Broca's area. The pathway for learning to read has to add a little bit onto that. We, of course, have to start with the occipital lobe, where visual processing happens. And this requires converting visual images to sounds. And this is where it's going to be helpful to have a little bit of terminology at our fingertips. So many of you probably are already familiar with this terminology. I just want to share it and make sure that everybody who's on the webinar today has sort of a common understanding. So we're going to talk about phonemes, which are the smallest sounds of speech. So b or d or those are discrete individual sounds that we combine to put a word together. So when we're able to do that, of course, and understand that those letters are individual sounds that can be combined in different ways, we call that phonemic awareness. So the concept that speech is composed of individual sounds and that we can discern them and the sequence in which they are said, that's what we call phonemic awareness. And the same sounds can be combined and recombined. So when we are recognizing, for example, the differences among rhyming words, dog and bog and log and hog, we are developing phonemic awareness. When we manipulate those sounds and hear syllables and the like, we refer to that as phonological processing. And this is when we often play around with these kinds of things when we're young. I remember we used to have fun when we were kids saying our names backwards. My maiden name was Perkins, which is really great when you reverse it because it's Snickrip. And so lots of hilarity ensues, of course. It was pretty fun at the time, but that's an example of phonological processing, really understanding that we can combine, we can break words into syllables, we can distinguish parts of them, and all that kind of thing. Decoding, of course, is when we are presented with a sound, a symbol, and have to correlate it with a sound to decipher a new word by sounding it out. And then finally, phonics is simply the instructional system that we use to teach students phonemic awareness and phonological processing. When we learn to read, most people will go through 3 basic steps. And the first one is what we refer to as the pictorial stage. Those of you who have had small children will probably remember how fun it was when you were driving around and they looked at that hexagonal, or maybe it's octagonal, sign with the STOP on it and said, oh, that sign says stop. Well, this is sort of an artificial form of reading. It really is the visual system that recognizes a word as if it were an object or a face. It's simply a picture. And they could name the picture the same way they would name a picture of a chicken in a book or whatever. So they start to recognize their own names and perhaps some other words that they might see commonly around, such as stop on the stop sign or the McDonald's sign and those sorts of things. After that, though, if we're going to be readers, most individuals go through the next stage, which is called the phonological stage. And this is a discovery. In fact, if you don't do this, then that's likely to result in a form of dyslexia because you are not going to be able to decode words. But here you discover that speech is made up of phonemes, made up of sounds that we can combine and recombine, and phonemic awareness. And virtually in every case, this has to be taught. The concept that cat has 3 sounds or phonemes, k, eh, t. And then at this stage, we don't necessarily process words as whole words, except maybe a few sight words that we've learned. But what we do, or we're tending to isolated letters and letter groups, and we're trying to figure out how to attack those and how to produce them and combine them fluently into something that sounds like a word and sounds like the word for an object that we know. So this is the stage at which we realize that sounds or phonemes are represented on paper by letters, which we also can refer to as graphemes, or that the letters stand for sounds. And then finally, as we do this more and more and more and more, we get a vast vocabulary of words. And as we practice them, we start again to see words as whole units, and we process them unconsciously, not sounding out letter by letter as we do in the phonological stage. It turns out, it's been researched that's really interesting, that reading time is not influenced by word length. It's determined by how often a word has been encountered. So we can read words that are very long if we've seen them frequently without even thinking about them, we just recognize them. And as we increase in fluency, this allows meaning and comprehension to increase because now we've got room in working memory that's not taken up with all of that other stuff. The typical healthy reader uses both the phonological pathway and the direct pathway. So the direct pathway is the sight words, the words that we've learned that are automatic and we just know what they mean and can produce them. And the phonological pathway is when we encounter a new word or something we're not familiar with and we have to be able to decode it and sound it out. So as we said, many of the cognitive processes that we referred to earlier are required for language and are also very, very important for reading. And this is really important to understand because we tend to think of reading as composed of 3 or 4 very sort of simple basic processes. If I talk to most teachers and ask them about the basics of reading I will often hear something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. Well, as you've just seen, there is no decoding part of our brain. We have to build those structures that were not innately there and connect up the structures that were designed for vision, designed for recognizing faces, designed for recognizing spoken words, and we have to co-opt them. And then we have to have a bunch of other things going on at the same time. When we build fluency, a process like flexible attention, that's what allows our brains to go back and forth very rapidly and fluently between the direct pathway and the phonological pathway. So when we switch back and forth, if it takes us a long time and that cognitive flexibility isn't there, that's going to really slow us down and really impair fluency. If it's working well, of course, that's going to help us really build our fluency more quickly. And then ultimately, comprehension. We use that example of the Mary Poppins story about how important it is to even understand it, for us to be able to visualize, to hold that information in our mind while we think about it, while we relate it to what we already know and create meaning. So clearly a little more complicated than how we've sometimes tended to think about it. Now what we want to do is we want to shift our focus to some of the reasons that English is particularly challenging. So we've already seen reading is a pretty hard thing to be able to do. We don't come about it naturally. And most of you can probably think about some things about written English just off the top of your heads that are problematic for your students. If you would like to share some, again, we would invite you to type into the chat window. People always like to hear what other people's students struggle with, and very often it's the same things that they struggle with. And okay, great. So please go ahead and share that if you'd like. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Anne, who's going to tell us about how problematic English is.
Hello. Thanks, Betsy.
Yeah.
Okay, so English is actually one of the most difficult languages to learn to read. And that, you know, it's the erratic spelling system of the English language and the fact that it's not phonetic, basically. There was a cross-national study done in the UK with all these different languages, 14 languages across Europe, and what they did was they tested kids after 1 year of instruction, their first year of reading instruction, and you can see here that like Finnish all the way to Norwegian, you know, these students scored at almost 100% level, meaning they could read almost 10 out of 10 words correctly after 1 year of instruction. Finnish is, and these are ranked pretty much by level of how phonetic they are. And so you get down to French, Portuguese, and Danish, and it's a little less, you know, it's down to about 70 to 80%. But English, it just drops drastically down to 35%. So after 1 year instruction, students could only read about 3 to 4 words out of 10 correctly. And, you know, we know that because of the way English is a combination of so many different languages. It's a rich language. But that the way we've kept the spelling and the way we've, you know, that is really hurt us in our ability to teach reading. So, you know, some language systems are based on a system where each syllable is represented by a symbol. And once you learn the symbols, you've mastered the system. So we could see that in the Finnish. And spoken English contains approximately 5,000 different possible syllables. Written English uses a system of letters to make up a spoken syllable. A letter alone does not refer to anything. So it's the combination that gives us, obviously, our word structure. So in English, there are 42 phonemes, but only 26 letters. And so letters are combined to make sounds, like our digraphs, ch and sh, and v, you know. But letters also make more than one sound. You can see here that the letter U makes 7 different sounds, and it's not just our vowels, but our consonants as well can make more than one sound. In fact, 13 out of 26 letters make more than one sound. And then letters are silent, and there's not often an indication why they're silent. And there's inconsistencies in it as well, like the word sign, the G is silent. But in related words like signature or signal, the G is not silent. And then it's not always clear where our syllable breaks occur. So, you know, for instance, SH we teach as a digraph, but obviously here in reality, the EA we also teach as a digraph often. And converged and converted, 1 letter difference, but one's a 2-syllable word and one's a 3-syllable word. So, yeah, okay. So you can see where these are just the basic components, really, of what makes English difficult to learn to read. So we learn rules to make up for this. And like, for instance, we first learn our standard sounds. So for example, the A, I, and O, standard sounds are A, I, A. But then we have a rule for when the letters actually say their names.
So I bet everybody in the audience can probably name this rule.
Yep, silent E. So when that E's at the end of the word, it's silent, but it jumps over and makes the vowel say its name. Magic E, yep. And then, but that doesn't even work all the time. Look at it. Gave, have, agave, cove, love, move, cone, gone, none, 5, give, Nike. So we've just got tons of exceptions. I was thinking that look how much inhibitory control needed for all of these exceptions.
Yeah, exactly. You have to stop before you say it and say, okay, that's not one of those. It's one of those other things. And I have to apply the other rule. I have to suppress one and I have to exercise the other.
And usually it's like, oh, look, there's the rule. And you're just happy if remembered the rule. But then there's the overlay of the exceptions. Yeah. We got another example of this. Again, we got our standard sounds for A, E, O, but we need a rule again for when we have the spelling pattern A, I, E, A, and O, A. Does anybody know this rule? Go ahead, Betsy, we'll put it up there. It's the 2 vowels go walking. The first one does the talking. Yep.
Let's see if somebody, this is one that I didn't learn per se. Oh, she did it. She got it.
Sorry, Dee, I jumped in there.
Good for her. Good for Dee. Like, that's great. She had it halfway written, and then but she gets full credit for that one.
That's right. So, but then we have these these are just a few of the exceptions here. The EA combination, we found like 8 or 9 really common words that have completely different pronunciations. But you can see the rule doesn't always work. In fact, there's often 10 or more exceptions to the rule with really common words.
In fact, I think that we talked about this earlier, Anne, about the percentage of words that are of the common words in the language that actually you can pronounce or read just with standard sounds.
Yeah, it's over 50% of the words in English don't play fair or don't play by the rules.
Yeah, that makes it pretty hard. We teach kids to play fair in kindergarten, and then we tell them that there's no playing fair in reading when we get to this stage. So what we want to focus on just for a little bit here is to talk about what some neuroscience-based approaches to reading skills would be. And we've sort of, as we've talked today, we've focused on a couple of areas. One is the underlying cognitive skills that we use in language and in reading. And the fact that reading puts such a demand on them. So one of the things that we could do is to strengthen those underlying cognitive skills so that they work more effectively. The other side of it is, since reading does require, and in English in particular, because as we've said, we have to utilize all these cognitive processes regularly, if we can reduce that cognitive load during the stages of learning to decode, maybe that might help as well. And so that's what we're going to share with you for the next few minutes. So it turns out that you can, in fact, build and strengthen the underlying cognitive infrastructure for learning. Both of those foundational cognitive skills, things like attention and visual processing and short-term sensory memory, so all those things we talked about, as well as the executive functions like working memory and inhibitory control. And there are techniques that have been developed by a variety of different kinds of clinical disciplines: speech pathology, vision development, psychology, others. And they've been used in a clinical setting for decades, actually. For those of you who work with us, you know that all those techniques, or a collection of them, has been translated into a computer program called Brainware, which is quite effective at developing this underlying cognitive infrastructure. And what we've seen now with over a decade of research with Brainware is that we can, just by improving cognitive skills with no change in reading instruction, actually can result in gains in reading skills. So this is a fairly recent example of a group of struggling readers who used Brainware for 12 weeks. And 12 weeks corresponds to about a third of a grade equivalent. What we're looking at here is a performance of these students on the Woodcock-Johnson academic tests as measured by grade equivalent. And so in 12 weeks, we would expect about a third of a grade equivalent to be the improvement. But instead, in sentence fluency, the students experienced over 2 grade equivalents of growth in sentence fluency, 3.5 grade equivalents of growth in word fluency. By the way, it also helped math along the way, because of course these are the processes that we use in everything we do, not just reading, but math and social emotional behavior and pretty much everything we do in interacting with the environment. But this is, so interesting, because we don't instruct reading as part of Brainware. It's really just working on the underlying cognitive processes. Now, the school that did this particular study uses Fountas and Pinnell reading levels to evaluate student progress. And students are supposed to gain about 3 reading levels per year. So we would expect in a third of a year about one reading level of improvement. These students on average improved over 4 reading levels. In fact, all of them reached their grade level reading, even though some of them were quite far behind. One student actually gained 10 reading levels, and all of them gained at least 1 reading level, which is the expected improvement in 12 weeks. So this is what we can do when we strengthen those underlying skills by increasing a student's ability to manage all that cognitive load. And now Anne is going to share the other approach, which has to do with lightening that cognitive load.
Yeah. So there you go. So lightening that cognitive load means for us offering a way of presenting English in a phonetic format that does not change the spelling, which we call readable English. And what we do is add syllables so that the words are automatically broken up for students. We gray out the silent letter and leave it in there so that students know that it should not be pronounced, but they can recognize it when they see it again. And then when a letter makes a sound other than its usual sound, we put a diacritical mark on it, or we call it glyph, to help students both learn that letters make more than one sound, and it also gives a pronunciation guide basically built right into each word. So the phonetic markings end up being like training wheels basically for reading. So just for example, like this word yacht, I mean, who in the world would know that that said yacht? It would be yatched, right? Or yatchet. And you can just see by the markup that they might know the word yacht orally. They might, if they heard it pronounced, they would know what it meant.
But probably not get it if you said yatchet.
Right. If they were to read it that way, they would make no connection to that word that they knew. So you can see here the grayed out CH, it's not pronounced, with the little Ozzy Oswald glyph over the A, it says ah, and they can sound it out. And then not even slowly over time, because the spelling's kept intact, we're able to translate that over to standard English quite easily. So we've done some research at one school in Indiana, Springs Valley. We had the Title I students from each of these classes, grades 1 through 3. And this was started in late January last year and went through April, I believe. And the expected improvement versus the actual improvement in rate, accuracy, fluency, and comprehension were quite astounding. So much so that the school now has all their first graders basically learning readable English to help them avoid having to be frustrated and struggle later. But you can see the gains were quite significant. We also did a study. We're also in a middle school in Indiana, and this grade 8 were actually special ed kids, 15 special ed kids, where they achieved their yearly growth target in 9 months and on average exceeded it by 313%. This particular class were the highest growing group in the school, and these kids ended up getting awards, and it's just beautiful how it's changed their attitude towards themselves, school, learning, reading. And then the 6th grade teacher had, noticed such a difference in these students' attitudes. She wanted to know what was happening. So she asked if she could teach it to her whole class, not just the struggling students. And they had, so her class, you can see the difference between the expected growth and actual growth. They exceeded their yearly growth target on average by 115%, whereas the control group barely made any difference, 8%, or only 47% of their students achieved their target. So that particular school's got a third of their school using the program now. But that's just making English phonetic, really. We weren't even working on comprehension, but comprehension's also going on.
Right, because when you lighten that cognitive load,
Right.
then you're going to be able to have more of your working memory dedicated to the tasks of comprehension. And so you just, that's very consistent with what we would expect to happen based on our understanding of the role of these skills in the reading process. So we have a few minutes left, and would certainly welcome everybody to ask any questions. You can type them either into the question area or into the chat window. Also, if anybody is interested in learning more about either of the programs themselves, just give us a little note there. And I know that sometimes questions don't occur to you, or you don't have the time to type everything you'd like to into that chat window. So if it's easier to send us an email address, an email, then we provide our address. So here's our contact information, and hope that you'll be in touch and we can continue these discussions as we go forward. So let me see if there's anything. I'm not seeing anything. We'll give everybody a minute or so to completely understand how the training wheels lighten the cognitive load, but have to check that the children knew their phonemes prior to the program. If you can comment on that, that's really understanding standard sounds, I think, is what that question's about, Anne.
Yeah, definitely we start with teaching the standard sounds first. And then after they're pretty solid with those, then move into teaching these glyphs. You know, at the same time they're learning those spelling patterns, they're learning the glyphs.
Right. And then I know sometimes, I haven't seen that question yet, but often we get a question that has to do with whether students, once they, become like super dependent on the clues that are provided by the, by Readable English, by the syllable breaks and the glyphs and the graying out. But you actually find the opposite, I think. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, what starts to happen is the students ignore everything, ignore the glyph, because they're seeing the whole word now. They're recognizing the whole word. It's just become a sight word to them. And so they start ignoring the glyphs. They also have reported that just in standard English, they'll say, oh yeah, I saw that, I could see the upper cup glyph over it, or they actually recalled the glyph being there, and it helped them for some kids. So it hasn't been something they need to unlearn later at all so far.
Yeah, because you're really turning it into a sight word, but associated with the correct pronunciation, because they've been able to figure it out. And then with practice, it's going to become just a standard sight word, the way that we've all mastered those. All right, let me check the, I don't see anything in the Q&A either. Okay. Well, if you have questions or would like more information, we look forward to following up with you. And any suggestions as to how to address newcomers and their language? Anne, you want to?
Well, when you say newcomers,
I'm assuming it's students who have very little English.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, it would be a matter of almost treating them like an emerging reader, where they definitely have to have their standard English sounds, and then start teaching them the the glyphs. There's 21 of those glyphs basically, and it makes over 99% of the words phonetic, so that they can at least start sounding out words. And the good news about this program for English language learners is once they get that system down, when they're coming across the word they don't know, like yacht, they're not sounding it out phonetically and getting an incorrect pronunciation fossilized in their head, right? So if we can sound out a word correctly the first time, we're more likely to remember it. But if we've learned it incorrectly, it's really difficult to unlearn that. So this system helps them build that confidence in their pronunciation of words.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because we, when we're learning to read, most of the words we know already. We've heard them, we can pronounce them. But if you're learning to read English at the same time you're learning the language and the vocabulary itself, then you may be learning a lot of it from the written. So if you have more of an opportunity for those mistakes to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So vocabulary would still need to be addressed, for this, but that pronunciation piece is really key for English language learners. And there's not really anything out there other than having a lot of practice with speaking.
Right. I think we may have lost Anne's audio there.
Oops.
I can't.
I kind of sorry about that. Lost. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's great. Getting to implement the program would be great at the middle and high school level. Okay, so we'll definitely follow up with you and talk about that. It's been used at middle school, and you've used it some at high school, haven't you, Anne?
We were at one alternative high school, and we had really good results with that as well. Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for spending your time with us this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you happen to be. We really appreciate your sharing your time with us, and we really enjoyed it. And I want to thank you very much, Anne, for taking your time today to share your great insights with us.
Thank you.
We hope you'll all be back at another webinar sometime soon. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your week.